Good morning, everyone. I know we have a few people that are still going to be signing on, but we are at 10 o'clock. So, or sorry, 10 a.m. Pacific time, and then that would be, I believe that's noon Mountain Time. So, in any event, so good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. I am Julie Mitchell. I am a longtime NAMA member and on the board of directors, and I work for the Haz Waste Management Program in King County, Washington. And it's my pleasure and welcome to our webinar. And it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter today, Martin Quinn from Washington State Department of Ecology. And he has graciously um, uh, he's graciously accepted to be our webinar host and to be giving us some valuable information today. And so I'm going to turn it over to Martin. However, before I do, just a quick housekeeping thing. Martin's going to go through his presentation, and you are welcome to put your questions in the Q&A. And but we will probably need to hold the answers to those to the end so that Martin can get through his presentation. But I will also be monitoring that for him. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Martin.
Thanks, Julie. My name is Martin Quinn. I'm a facilities specialist with Washington Department of Ecology. I've been with the agency about 17 years. And for the last 6, I've been a facilities specialist in the solid waste unit. Part of my job is going around every 5 years and inspecting household hazardous waste facilities with the health districts, who are the ones in Washington State that issue the permits for those facilities. I've got quite a few slides to get through, so I'm going to go fairly quickly, but hopefully we can get through them and I can answer any questions. It might help if you note which slide your question pertains to. So if you could possibly try and write some description of what the slide is. If we need to go back to it, we can. So let's get started. So 5 typical issues we encounter at facilities is issues regarding proper sorting and segregation, issues with secondary containment, issues regarding bulk and safety, issues regarding a facility's operating plan that might be missing or out of date or not exist at all, and then engineering controls that aren't functioning correctly. We'll go through these in a lot more detail as we proceed. Other common issues, reporting, for example. Now, most people might think about reporting and think, well, how is that safety related? But generally, if someone's not keeping good records, they're probably not maintaining paperwork on inspections and other issues. And usually, if a facility's got all its reporting buttoned up, chances are that they're meeting all the other requirements and operating in a safe manner. It just seems to go hand in hand. Other issues we have, ventilation ducts, flammable gas monitoring issues, tanks, container suitability and condition, and sumps. This is an obvious example where materials aren't being stored correctly. At least they're in a containment locker, but as you can see, everything's clustered. You have an open container with the funnel still in it on the left-hand side. You can see damaged containers. You can see stuff all piled in there. Not easy to get to anything, and chances are you would not spot a leak probably until it's too late. One of the problems with the grid type sumps that they have in these lockers or any secondary containment in a lot of cases, if the liquid goes to the bottom of the container and you can't see through the grid, you don't know that a leak has occurred. So very obviously a problem in this situation. Next slide, again, just way too much materials, almost certainly inadequate containment. And one of the issues we also come across is people storing non-MRW in these containers. You can see the picture on the right has a first aid container in there, which probably isn't an issue, but I've seen ladders, bicycles, chop saws, all kinds of weird stuff, flexes, electrical flexes. So really the lockers and the storage areas should be just for a specific type of MRW, or sorry, household hazardous waste. I've put MRW down the bottom there. That's a Washington state only term, so I probably shouldn't have used it, but it just means moderate risk waste, which refers to both household hazardous waste and waste produced by small quantity generators, which our facilities are allowed to also receive. But clearly here it's been overfilled. The material's not stacked properly. It looks like you've got commingling of different types of hazard classes. And, you know, when you've got a glass jar, for example, in the picture on the right, stacked on top of numerous other wastes, that's an obvious problem. So we don't want to see anything like this. It's just an accident waiting to happen. Another instance we get is small containers where, again, it's probably overfilled. Materials are just dumped in there, and oftentimes you're commingling incompatible materials. Another example here, plenty of bad examples, unfortunately. Most of these pictures are fairly old, though I do have some pictures in this presentation that were taken as recently as just a couple of days ago. But for obvious reasons, this is an issue. You can't store materials like this and expect it to be meet the standards, the regulatory standards, or be safe. Another picture from the same facility there. With regards to drums, the picture on the right is obviously a better way of storing stuff. They do appear to have some plastic container that's compromising what we have a 30-inch required minimum distance from any drums, or aisle space, I should say, with the labels appropriately facing the direction of visibility so that the tanks can be readily identified. The picture on the left, obviously, you've got tanks stacked very high. Chances are you wouldn't notice that they're leaking. And obviously they could be corroded or other corroded tanks or other problems back there. And getting to a tank in an emergency is almost an impossibility in that scenario. Whereas a scenario on the right, if a tank's leaking, you probably would notice a lot sooner, and you'd be able to get access to it without having to move any of the other drums, I should say. I think I was saying tanks before, I should have said drums. But the drums should be positioned such that you can readily see the condition of them, identify any leaks, and also access it in an emergency fairly quickly. It's pretty common sense, but often pick up on issues with these drums being too close to each other and not having enough space around them. It's important that all the lockers are clearly identify what's meant to go in them, and you know, the larger the sign, the more useful. Sometimes I see pieces of just painter's tape just stuck on something with something scribbled on there, and that's not often useful. So nice legible signs are always a bonus. Segregation of incompatible materials is important. In this case, the materials were getting left on the access road to a transfer station outside of the outside of the household hazardous waste receiving facility. And as you can see, there's materials through here that are incompatible. Some of the containers are questionable, but it's important that as soon as they get received, they get segregated and they're placed into suitable containment areas with secondary containment. You've got to remember that any unknowns you receive until you've identified what they are by doing a categorization on them, they're going to be incompatible with each other. You have to assume that you can't allow these materials to have the potential to mix, because in a lot of ways, an unknown is worse than many other chemicals that might have a high hazard potential. But if you don't know what the chemicals are, you've got to assume a worst case scenario, really, until you've been able to categorize it properly. So getting those materials into the receiving facility, into a locker, into secondary containment is very important. Can't be left on the side of the road just waiting for someone to find the time. For example, the picture on the left, you can see with the black container in the green tote does not even have a lid on it. So various issues there, and I believe the one behind it doesn't either. That's just a bit of foil on the lid. Yeah, this is problematic. And of course, we don't want reactions occurring and causing exothermic reactions or any kind of releases to the atmosphere that would create a hazard for the people around these materials. Containers have to be suitable. You can see the one on the left, a bunch of jars of material have been left, containers of material have been left in a tote and they've split and they've not received attention. You can see the lines where the material has evaporated over time. So it's been like that for a long while. So they're basically sitting in a bath there of a leak, and that does need prompt attention. The picture on the right, obviously you've got a container that's leaking, no one's bothered to clean it up properly, and as it evaporates, that's going to pose a health risk to the operators. We have issues with missing caps and seals, rusting or corroding containers, damaged or malformed containers, and you have to also be wary of non-original containers. So you don't know if the container material is suitable. If it's a corrosive, you don't want it in a metallic container, though some corrosives are in stainless steel containers, for example, nitric acid. But in general, you want to make sure that the containers, that the materials are either coming in into the facility and are suitable for the material they're containing and be labeled. If they're not labeled, they need to be marked as an unknown and placed somewhere until it's been properly categorized. You can't just take the word of the person that bought the waste in that the material is what they say it is, because they might just be guessing. A lot of stuff that turns up at these places has been cleared out of someone's relative's house or has been found in the basement when someone's bought a house, and they'll think they know what it is, but they might not be a professional that knows how to categorize these things. Again, unmarked, rusting, damaged, or spilling containers are a problem. This was from an inspection just a couple of days ago here. You've got a dented, damaged container that's obviously rusting. There's a glass jar beside it. Neither are marked with what's in there. So even if someone's done some tests or asked the person who bought them in what's inside it, no one else knows, and so that's a problem. The picture on the right, clearly, I believe this is some kind of chlorate compound that's leaking. It's just been left on a shelf. This is in the facility, so it's important to get anything like that into another container quickly and identify or label it appropriately. Something you might not normally think of, empty drums or supplies. They should be kept separate from your household hazardous wastes. I recommend marking empty container areas with a sign for two reasons. One, to avoid drums with material being left there, because I do see that quite a lot. Often say, what's in these drums over here? And I get told they're empty. And I start shaking them or moving them or agitating them. Not particularly violently, just in case there's something that might react in there. But oftentimes there are materials left there by someone who doesn't normally work in that area or isn't aware of where they should be putting these materials. So if you mark it, that's less likely to happen. The other thing is, in the event of a fire or other emergency, the fire department, for example, aren't going to waste their time spraying down empty drums if they're trying to stop flammables from catching. So it makes sense to have them separate and marked. It's not a requirement in Washington State to mark this area, but it makes sense for a number of reasons. And it's good practice. So secondary containment in Washington State, at least, we require 10% of the total volume of liquid or the volume of the largest container, whichever's greater. So if you have one container, for example, a 55-gallon drum, you'd have to have the whole 55 gallons. If you had 2 or 3 or more on there, it's 10% of the total. And that's based on container size, not on how full the container is. So you have to make sure that your secondary containment is adequate because you don't want the material spilling over in the event of a leak because it's not doing its job then. Be of suitable materials, so steel drums for flammables as a general rule and poly drums for corrosives. You don't want any reactions between the contents and the drum. Segregated into main hazard classes or further segregated as appropriate. So, for example, certain things aren't suitable to go in with what you would assume is the main hazard class, an example of which might be aerosols, where the propellant is a flammable, yet the active ingredient inside it is a pesticide or a toxin. Obviously, if it's a flammable, it's going to go in the flammable section, despite the product being for another purpose. It must also actually hold the material, so you don't want cracks or gaps, and it must be impermeable. So, for example, concrete floors that are sometimes relied upon, if they have cracks, gaps, etc., that's questionable, and in some cases, it's better if they're treated with chemical-resistant paint. And then the next item is actually Washington state specific, but it's something to consider. Provide for additional capacity for containments for a storm event if it's uncovered, and also from flow from any fire suppression, because if the fire system goes off, whether it's a sprinkler or a powder system or whatever, you don't want it to surcharge and flush stored materials outside of the containment area. Here's an example where housekeeping hasn't been done properly. On the right is just a case of just dirt and cobwebs, and it's obvious that they've not paid any attention to cleaning the sump area within the containment locker. But the one on the left is a little more worrisome because it could have household hazardous waste materials in there. And as they accumulate, of course, they're going to evaporate and present a risk to worker safety through inhalation hazard. It could be flammable, and it certainly could be reactive with other materials that are stored in there, and a leak that might occur at a future date may cause a reaction. But even though you would assume that most people would take care of this, it's quite common for us to find problems where, to the point that, for example, the secondary containment volume is compromised by the amount of debris or liquids that have leaked down into these sumps. They do need to be kept clean and be inspected on a fairly regular basis. In this case, we have some pictures of where secondary containment's just gone out the window, and you can see where there's stains on the ground. And bear in mind that this isn't just a potential discharge to the environment. This is also a potential risk where materials are left there, and then other materials may leak or be dropped or spilled in the area and react with those because they're incompatible. So it's quite important that these secondary containments are provided for and used appropriately. Another example here, we have lead acid auto batteries. The one on the right has adequate containment. They're off the ground. The second one, it's in a locker, storage locker with secondary containment. They're just all piled in there. You could have the terminals contact and create a spark. You've got other materials, flammable materials such as the cardboard box, and there's some drums in there of material that clearly don't have enough space around them. So yeah, these are situations that could lead to a dangerous situation, aside from being out of compliance with regulatory requirements. Other facilities have these concrete type bays. They're usually fairly good. They have a built-in sump channel. Sometimes these channels are interconnected, but sometimes they're blocked off. So it's important to understand that they need to be kept clear as well in the event of a spill. Good signs, having it well posted as to what household hazardous wastes are, where they should be placed, and so in this case they have very clear signs. It's a good thing. I mentioned earlier that some people use painter's tape and just scribble something on there, and that may or may not fall off at a later date, but a well-fixed, well-legible sign that's robust, isn't going to just peel off, or isn't paper that's going to get damp and shrivel up. It's good to have these signs, and once it's done, it should serve the lifetime of the facility. I want to talk a bit about engineered safety controls. That would be mechanical ventilation, flammable and explosive gas monitoring, grounding and bonding for bulking here. With regards to bulking safety, it's always important that the ventilation is actually turned on. Some facilities have an on-off switch that may or may not be on while they're actually bulking. Some facilities have it wired into their lighting system. So if someone's in there and they've got the lights on, then the ventilation system's working. But it's very important that these engineered systems are functioning correctly and providing the protection they were designed to provide, because they should do that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and stop any accumulations of pollutants into the atmosphere that would pose a risk to workers at the facility. Here we have a couple of examples where they've got ventilation for bulking or ventilation for their lockers. And as you can see, the picture on the left, the ventilation hood's really too high. It's probably going to short circuit. You've got too much adventitious air supply that could come from another direction. So it's likely to be sucking from the sides and not clearing those any vapors from those drums there. And then the one on the right, you can see it's been terminated too far away from the edge of the facility, so it's inclined to blow back in or just hit the ceiling. And as you can see, the one at the bottom, whatever's been blowing on there has actually corroded the paint off of the structure, so not good. Okay, here's an example of other bulking safety where you can evacuate the fumes from the tops of the drums. So there's different ways of providing this ventilation. Here we have a ventilation hood for the purpose of identifying unknowns. So even if you're not bulking, it's important to consider ventilation, for example, when you're opening containers, to identify what the contents are. And then here's another example where they've got movable ventilation, where they can actually go and position it right where the source is. So there's different ways of achieving this ventilation. And then with regards to flammable gas monitoring, it's important that the sensor location is placed in an appropriate location. Oftentimes we see them too high, or they have low sensors only. Ideally, you want a sensor low because most flammable gases will sink. And of course, you want to pick up the accumulation of those gases at the earliest stage possible, well before the point at which they reach flammable levels. You also want to have a sensor somewhere in the area where someone's breathing, so at standing height, so that when they're bulking, if there's any vapors coming out of the drums or the baling container, the alarm will trigger if those levels are getting higher. Let's go to the next slide. In this case, you can clearly see that the sensor is kind of well away from where bulking would occur. And although it's somewhat in the region of the breathing zone, it's probably too high. That's just an example of what we've seen in the field. We want these engineering controls to be installed correctly so that they'll provide the protection they're designed to provide. Just some examples of the readout panels. Many facilities don't often understand how these work or how to check them. And it's quite common to come across a facility that either has this turned off completely because it keeps going off and it's annoying them. Obviously, it's doing its job. It's going off for a reason, or it's not calibrated properly. But it's important that these function and operators are aware where it is and also on what gas it's calibrated. Most times it's methane, sometimes it's hexane, but they should know what the calibration gas is and also where at what level it's set to trigger at. Aside from the fixed flammable gas monitoring, there are personal detectors that you can wear on your belt, or you can have a handheld such as a multi-ray. These can pick 4, 5, or even 6 gases out and create alarms, including low oxygen, carbon monoxide, CO2, hydrogen sulfide, and methane or another flammable gas. And they often have visible and audible alarms. It's just another option to consider. Inbuilt gas detection is probably better, but these are a good supplement or an alternative if necessary. With regards to grounding and bonding, it's quite common that we see the drums are grounded for bulking of flammable materials, but you don't want to have any sparks. So it's important the receptacle is bonded as well, so that the drum and the receptacle are at the same potential. And the receptacle can be bonded to the drum if the drum is grounded, or directly to ground itself. The next picture is a bit more complicated, but it's the same situation. So obviously you have a grounding bar and you're connecting the receiving container to the ground, and then the receptacle you're using to bail the liquids in, that also has to be bonded as well, because if it's at a different potential and there's a spark, that's not good in a flammable environment or potentially flammable environment. With regards to fire systems and fire extinguishers, it's important these are in a suitable location. You may recall the earlier slide where they had the concrete bays where they were storing materials, and I believe there was fire extinguishers on the top of each segregating wall, so they were visible and readily accessible. In this case, we've got a shelf, and this was in a transfer station. They thought they were doing the right thing by pulling out household hazardous waste from the tip floor and putting them on a shelf, but of course they don't have secondary containment. They don't have proper segregation because some of these materials are incompatible. And at the same time, the shelf has been positioned around the fire extinguisher. So in an emergency, it'd be hard to get to, and staff might not even know it's there. The operations plan I mentioned earlier, it's really important that a facility has one of these. A lot of facilities have trained staff. They might have their HAZWOPER, they might have done the 24 HHW training. They might have other relevant trainings, and they might have many decades of experience, but a facility's own specific operating plan, it's good to have one of those simply because it's specific to your operation and how things are meant to be done. Quite often these haven't been updated for too long and practices have changed, or new staff aren't aware that they exist or where they are. I've also come across problems where the workers at the facility don't read or speak adequate English to be able to understand that plan. So in that case, that plan should be translated into the language that they can understand, such that they can actually operate in the facility safely. So it's important to have that consideration. Just in case. There's no way anyone's going to understand what's being required of them if they don't know where the plan is and it's written in a language they understand. But that's something I've come across recently. So that's just something that I had never thought of before, but it's important that people know about their plans. So I want to talk about dealing with spills and problems that facilities might encounter. So it's very important to understand that facility operators aren't emergency personnel. They're not the fire department. They're not likely to be a qualified hazmat responder. Even if they've got their HAZWOPER, they might not be competent enough to deal with certain levels of spill and certain problems. So it's important, very important, that operators don't exceed their abilities of their equipment or their supplies or their level of expertise. It's better to call someone else in that can help with this than get in over your head and have problems. The most important thing at the facility is the lives of the people that are there. So when necessary, get help and get out. You can contact the fire department, contract a cleanup crew that is qualified and has the supplies. And also, if you have a state hazmat spill response team, they can come out and help you with that and help you remedy a situation. It's important to get clear the facility, get the public and other operators away, and particularly upwind from any fumes or smoke in these situations. So just a reminder to facility operators that in the event of a spill or something going wrong, to be cautious of not taking on more than you can chew. So it's important to know what kind of spill you have in the event of something going wrong. Is it general? Is it oil? Is it chemical? Is it caustic or corrosive? Is it flammable? Is it solid or liquid? And if you don't know, just like with the incoming materials that are unknowns, that's probably the most dangerous situation because you're not sure how to handle that. So that can be even more problematic than some of the more serious materials you have on site. Caustic, strong bases such as sodium hydroxide and potassium hydroxide are examples of what might be on site. Corrosives attack other materials molecules one at a time with oxygen and water. Irritant at low concentrations, but at high concentrations will cause chemical burn risks. And reactions between acids and bases can be energetic with the release of a large amount of heat. So oftentimes these corrosives are stored together. And as you know, strong acids and bases can react quite violently and can release a lot of heat. So it's important to be aware of these materials, not only what they are and what you're dealing with and what the hazard classes are, but what the potential reactions between them are. With flammables, obviously you need to avoid any kind of ignition source. So sparks, even cell phones, other electrical equipment, static electricity. So you might want to choose your equipment such that you have anti-static cleanup equipment for the event of a flammable spill. And of course, as I mentioned before, make sure that the receptacle and the baling container are grounded if you're bulking a material after a spill. You don't want to have any sparks or any ignition sources. Cleanup materials that are likely flammable too. So you have to handle those and dispose of them accordingly. They can't just go in the trash necessarily. You have to treat them like the material that you've cleaned up. You've got to treat them in the same way. Cleanup materials could be incompatible as well, whether they're flammable or not. So you want to separate the disposal containers. I often see just one garbage can at these facilities with a lot of soaked rags. If they're different chemicals, they could be incompatible and they could react and cause a problem. Sorbent materials, you're looking at socks, cushions, pads, sweeps, litter, which is the granule materials. These can be specific to the spill medium. So for example, the oil pads, they're typically black. You can see those at the back of the shelf in that bottom right-hand corner. The oil pads are white. The black ones are both chemical and oil, and the yellow ones are chemical only, slipped up there. So you should treat the contaminated cleaner materials just as you would the material itself. If there's not a lot of contamination, it may be safe to dispose of it in the trash, but heavily soaked pads or booms, socks, etc. If there's a lot of free liquids in there, you do need to be mindful of treating them as you would the material cleaning up, because it's largely that's what you have there. For acids and bases, there's neutralizing agents that you can employ. I don't see many facilities that have, probably about half of them actually have these on site. So lime or baking soda or other specialized neutralizer for acids or commercial pH adjusters are suitable. Again, for bases, commercial pH adjusters, citric acid, sodium or potassium hydroxide or another acid might be suitable. Again, you have to be careful adding an acid to a base. You can get reactions there with the potential release of heat. So it's important to know, go through these just because it's trying to frame the idea that, you may need to consider whether you are actually qualified and have the competency to deal with a spill. If you're not thinking about these things, then maybe it's something that you have to leave to someone else that knows what they're doing. With acids and bases, dilution with water is not a good option. It's almost never a good option, to be honest, because the pH scale is logarithmic. So it needs many, many more times water. And the more you add, the more problem you've got to deal with because you've still got a spill. So it's just going to get bigger and bigger. And of course, water can react with certain chemicals. So it's important to make sure that you're aware of what the risks are. Neutralization reactions may cause heat splashing and fumes, so it's important to be aware of that and be prepared. So not just training and not just supplies, but the correct PPE, having adequate ventilation. A lot of people don't think about simply opening doors and windows in the event of a spill to get as much adventitious ventilation as you can, or bringing in some kind of forced ventilation including fans. Just a box fan alone could be enough to improve the situation and reduce the risks. Have an exit route plan, so if something goes wrong or you get a reaction that you didn't expect, then you know which way you're leaving and that way is clear. And have a respirator on if it's available. You want to have a mask if you are dealing with certain types of spill. But most cases, I don't see the facility operators having these available. And really, if they're concerned about any risk like that, it's something they should leave the cleanup to someone else. Again, neutralized materials may not be safe to dispose of as regular trash, so they may designate as a hazardous waste or be a fire hazard. So it's important to treat those materials as the source and not commingle those. So you can't be expected to readily deal with a spill without practicing and preparing. So it is important, if you're intending to deal with something like that, that you do some kind of training and you practice. It could be part of your monthly or more frequent inspections. And if you're alone at a facility and a spill occurs and you plan to clean it up, at least alert someone else, even if they're not on site, so they can check in with you and make sure nothing's gone wrong. You don't want to pass out and be laying in there exposed to fumes or contact with the material. If the situation changes, then change the situation. Get help, call for assistance, internal or external, and be ready for reactions or escalations in the severity of a spill. There's always unknowns at play. And then stay within the capability of your skills and your equipment. That includes tools and materials, so PPE and sorbents, etc. Just make sure that your supplies are adequate. Check that they're in date, because a lot of them do expire, and that they're in good condition. Maintain the equipment, whether it's detectors, make sure they're calibrated and charged. Make sure you have the PPE in the correct sizes and types. All gloves don't apply to all types of material. Respirator canisters, if you have them, are within their lifespan and appropriate to the protection levels that are required. And train regularly. I recommend swapping the roles for the team so everyone knows what part they're playing. But in the event that someone's missing from a team, someone can fill in. But it's important to train and be prepared for these. Spills may occur in vehicles when they're delivering materials. Some facilities are now writing contingencies for this into their operations plan, and it's important to think about these scenarios before they occur, just because there's some level of liability to going in someone else's vehicle if an event has occurred. Batteries that are damaged or broken or can misfunction can enter thermal runaway. Damage may not be obvious. The shock to a battery may have compromised it, and there might not be apparent damage to the casing. And once you're in thermal runaway, only cooling the cells down will help. Runaway cells can eject out to 60 feet. In fact, recently we had an event where they ejected 100 feet away. Each kilowatt hour of battery can produce up to 7 liters of noxious gases, hydrogen chloride, hydrogen fluoride, etc., and the nanoparticulate metals that you won't get out of your body once you've breathed them in. The best way to deal with them is try and get away from the battery or clear it away so that you can get upwind. Often this is well over 100 feet, up to 300 feet away, depending on the size of the issue. I've mentioned before, post-cleanup contamination of PPE and tools is important. Don't bring your work home with you. You don't want to be bringing home anything that has got any of the hazardous wastes on it. Clean the materials up. Replenish your supplies. The next spill could just be around the corner. So if you think something's happened and it's not going to happen again for the next 6 months, that's not necessarily the case. Prevention is better than cure. Preventing a spill is always easier and safer than cleaning one up. You can prevent spills by good housekeeping within your facility. Regular inspections of containers, secondary containment and sumps is important to make sure there's no leaks in there that are going to commingle with incompatible materials. Regularly service and ensure all engineering controls are functioning. That's the ventilation, your containment areas, your flammable gas monitoring, and ensure incompatibles are appropriately separated to avoid reactions when a spill does occur. So I'll hand back to Julie now. Thank you very much. There's my contact details, and they'll be available on the slides after the presentation.
All right. Thanks, Martin. And let's see, I didn't see anything in Q&A, so, but this is the time when we open it up for questions, if anybody has any. Okay, we've got one. Oh, we have a compliment. So our friend Jack Ranney, he enjoyed your presentation.
Oh, good. Thank you. Yeah, this is very much geared to the safety of the operators. When I talk with them, when I visit these sites, I always make it clear that you guys are here often 8 hours a day, however many days a week. I just turn up every so many years to make sure that the inspections being done aren't missing anything. And some facilities have made great leaps and bounds over the last few years, but unfortunately, it's occasionally the case that some go backwards, and then we do have some issues. But we don't want any unsafe situations or any unnecessary risks at these facilities.
All right. Well, I am not seeing any more questions. So, Martin, thank you so much for providing a really informative presentation and giving us these things to think about that sometimes we just get so busy during our day that
Sure.
that we don't think about and need to be reminded. So, all right, thank you to all of our attendees and have a great rest of the day, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.